our last talk, we concluded with what I called an experience of 3 separate tracks, so to speak, during the period in the private room, or during, in other words, doing centering prayer. And this is the point that I'd like to emphasize. Centering prayer is not, strictly speaking, itself contemplative prayer in the strict sense, or in the traditional sense of since St. John of the Cross wrote. Some people do think of centering prayer as a first step in contemplative prayer. And it's also possible to have a broader definition of contemplative prayer that would include a form of prayer that is a preparation or a sensitizing, so to speak, to the contemplative gifts of the Spirit, which are knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. I might add here that in addition to this sense of not being interested in the thoughts going by, that the divine action can get stronger and stronger as time goes on. And the grasping of the divine action can include not only the will, which enables us initially to be disinterested in the thoughts going by, but it also can suspend the imagination and the memory and even our reflective apparatus temporarily. And in that situation, one feels deeply present to God, deeply united, and in fact forgets oneself sometimes, more or less completely, so that one isn't even aware of praying, but is simply wrapped up in the experience of union. But these experiences are usually reserved for a certain amount of practice and the discipline of centering prayer over time. But one thing I would like to warn you about is that you can't really distinguish in the beginning of contemplative prayer, in the strict sense of the word, or infused contemplation, you cannot always distinguish when the Spirit is actually moving you and when your very gentle, ever so gentle action of returning to the sacred word is present, or the more subtle activity of the simple movement of your will, which is the third track, towards God in such a way that you are not interested in any thoughts going by. And so I might continue that subject from a slightly different perspective with a little more detail. And so we'll talk about, in this talk, what centering prayer is not, first of all, and then a few words about what centering prayer is. First thing it is not is it is not a technique. In a technique, as I understand it, you do a certain practice or discipline, physical or mental, and it issues in a result that you can more or less predict. Centering prayer is a method, but a kind of methodless method. It's the kind of method that you develop when you're trying to form a relationship with someone. Hence it has a great deal of openness or flexibility to what happens. In other words, when you are having a conversation with someone with whom you're in a relationship, you may have a few items you want to discuss, but the conversation may go in a direction you had no intention of going to. And if you want to maintain this friendship and openness to each other, you have to have a certain give and take about what you're going to talk about. So centering prayer is a relationship and a method for cultivating the relationship, not unlike cultivating the relationship of some other human being, whose chief characteristic or requirement is to hang out together. In other words, It's the time you put into this and the thoughtfulness in which you maintain the relationship, like sending a postcard when you're away or calling up your beloved when you're in town just to see how they are and so on. It's that giving them little presents on feast days and whatever. A technique, therefore, is something that produces a result. A method is something you do to cultivate a relationship, but it may not work. In other words, nothing may happen, or the friendship terminates for one reason or another. So the method of centering prayer, it's important to realize, is not going to produce a particular result, or at least it's not going to produce a result that you can anticipate and hence be annoyed with if it doesn't happen. It simply happens of itself by deepening the relationship until it becomes a presence-to-presence communion or union or unity even as time goes on. So hence it's futile to expect something specific to happen as a result of centering prayer, especially to have expectations during the period of centering prayer. And that's why we say that you can only judge the value or the purpose or the progress of your centering prayer and its evolution into contemplative prayer by its effects in daily life. That is, if you're bringing forth the fruits of the Spirit that Paul describes in Galatians, namely charity, joy, peace, gentleness, self-control, meekness, long-suffering, patience, and the others. In other words, if we're growing in this relationship with Christ in the inner room, then the mind of Christ or the influence of Christ's presence is going to produce results inside of us that we didn't expect, but which are not our ideas or our dispositions, but rather the transformation of our self-centered projects for happiness into the mind of Christ, into this movement towards love of one another, towards recognizing the oneness of the human family, the beauty of all creation, our responsibility to the environment, and our relationship of justice, honesty, and concern for the rights and needs of other people. These arise spontaneously, but are helped by definite efforts to forgive, to be reconciled, to be honest, and so forth. But there isn't a necessary connection that, that if you do this, this will happen. If you do centering prayer, anything can happen, including nothing for a long time, or great difficulties, because the relationship may move on to the divine therapy fairly soon, in which Christ begins to heal the deepest wounds of our human nature, from our personal history, going back farther and farther into early childhood, where most of our emotional problems actually began. Second, centering prayer is not a relaxation exercise. It's nice to be alone, that's relaxing. It's nice not to be thinking our ordinary thoughts. For a human being, the greatest vacation is not to have any thoughts for a while. Better than going to Miami or Snowmass for skiing is to be really silent, even for a few moments. It's refreshing. It puts a whole new dimension on our activities, and it frees us from the tumult of noise and worries and concerns and self-centered projects for happiness. But it may provide great relaxation as a kind of side effect, and so you may find more health, and you may find the need for even a little less sleep if you do the practice regularly, as we recommend, remember, twice a day. There's a great reason for doing it twice a day. that fits in here, because it's related to not so much relaxation, but peace in the midst of activity, including difficult activity, including draining activities. So many ministries in our time are extremely demanding, and hence they need that much more in the way of refreshment and relaxation to maintain our balance and equilibrium. Those who are constantly seeing human misery need to have periods of seeing nature's beauty and of also relating to God's goodness, and not just seeing what happens when people don't follow God's idea of the way people were made to function. And so this if we only do the prayer once a day, it's going to influence the first half or 3/4 of the day, depending on how much tension you experience in daily life. Each time a new crisis arises at the office, in the family, or in the ministry, some of that reservoir of peace, the waters of Siloe, so to speak, the refreshing waters of the divine presence, to use that image, gets drained. It's like running the water in your basin. Eventually, if you only have a tank up on the hill, it's going to run out. Well, for most human beings, their energy level, unless they're quite advanced, is pretty well ended by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Then comes a terrific crisis, maybe on the throughway or in the home. What are you going to do with that? Now it's time to bring the fruits of the Spirit into practice and to control your irritation or anger or whatever, and there's nothing left. And there's only a remote remembrance of how much peace you enjoyed in the morning. Now it's all gone. And so to pray again, like before supper, or if you can't do that, during the luncheon break, or certainly early in the evening, is a way of refreshing or refilling that reservoir of peace. Even though it's not a sensible peace, remember, it's still a real spiritual resource, is a great help to enabling that peace to influence the rest of the evening and the night. And in that sense, centering prayer is a spiritual relaxation exercise, because it relaxes the tension and turmoil that we'll otherwise experience needlessly if we don't do that or something similar. Centering prayer, of course, is not a form of self-hypnosis. It's not a kind of trance. There's no benefit in those things, except, again, to get some kind of relaxation. But those things are self-help, perhaps, and projects which may have some temporary value. But remember, we're dealing here not with self-help programs, but with a relationship that involves interaction, and action that is very refined because it's beyond conversation during the time of prayer. But it also, inspires us to try to continue that sense of God's presence throughout the day by working the effects of centering prayer, that is, the effects of praying in secret in the private room, into aspects of daily life. And later we'll describe various processes to bring those effects into daily life that are available in the tradition. Like saying an active prayer sentence frequently during the day, what used to be called aspirations or ejaculations, or in guarding the heart, watching to see when our motivation that has been purified during the time of centering prayer gets dominated by our old habits of self-centered search for happiness through affection, esteem, power, control, and security projects or drives. Centering prayer is also not a charismatic gift, which are fairly well known in our day. It's not like the gift of tongues or interpretation of tongues, gift of healing, or the knowledge of person's secret thoughts, or the miracles of some kind. These gifts are precious, but they're designed for the community as a whole and the building up of the Christian community, and don't necessarily transform the person who has them. So even though you have these gifts, without this interior movement towards the inner room and the purification of the unconscious that gradually accompanies it through the divine therapy, one could easily get caught on transferring one's worldly attitudes from projects of success from a worldly standpoint to the adulation or admiration of people who admire your teaching, or who want your miracles, or who like to hear you speak in tongues, or whatever. Notice that centering prayer and contemplative prayer is aimed at the essence of the spiritual journey, the deepening of the relationship with Christ, and the deepening of that relationship into a relationship with the other members of the Most Holy Trinity, all of whom are always present within us, 24 hours a day, always available. We must become available to that presence. Similarly, centering prayer is not a parapsychological phenomenon. Like in our day, there seems to be quite a few psychics around. Maybe the human family as a whole, as some anthropologists, or at least transpersonal psychologists think, is moving from the mental egoic or rational level of general consciousness in the population to the intuitive level. And hence, psychic gifts are simply part of the evolutionary development of the human brain, and we may see more and more of them. I remember meeting maybe a dozen in a single year who have different gifts, like seeing your aura, that is, whatever that is, the energy that can be picked up, seeing different colors during their prayer, being aware of communicating with people at a distance, or being able to read your body and where your diseases are. All these things can be marvelous helps to health and happiness, but they're all partial. They're all directed to a certain level of development, and the spiritual journey just goes on developing. And these are side effects that may occur in some people who are psychologically or temperamentally apt for these kind of gifts. If they are attached to these kind of gifts or make too much of them, then they become obstacles to the person who has them and can lead to spiritual pride, and hence the stalling of the actual spiritual journey that they are invited to by these gifts. More subtle still is the fact that centering prayer and contemplative prayer, to which it leads, is not the same as mystical phenomenon in the sense of levitation, visions or locutions, which can be outside oneself or in oneself or intellectual or even spiritual. In the case of spiritual communications, these are, St. John of the Cross speaks, are very close to divine union and almost inseparable from them. But the whole idea of ecstasy or phenomenon that are visible to other people, these are obviously may happen, but they're not appropriate to someone who's cultivating the private room, because in the private room one is not seen by other people, or is not involved for the time one is doing the prayer in secret with the environment. Hence, nobody knows what's going on there. So if you have ecstasies, save them for your private room. And they're not the essence of contemplative prayer, but simply a sign of its development. They can orientate one vigorously towards the spiritual journey, but what we are seeking in centering prayer and its development into contemplative prayer is transformation, which is the permanent relation to God, and not just a temporary spiritual experience or mystical experience, however exalted. And that's why we say that if during centering prayer you have a vision of Jesus at the right hand of the Father in glory, return to the sacred word. In other words, if you have the capacity, if you're not overwhelmed by the experience, return to the simple act of faith, hope, and love, because that's the essence of the journey. So as soon as you stop being overwhelmed, return to the sacred symbol you've had. Now you might say, well, wouldn't that be ungrateful? No, that would be a sign of pure love, because then you might say you're experiencing, maybe for the first time, the ultimate call of conversion. And there are many conversions as we progress in the spiritual journey, in which you're willing to give up love itself for love's sake. To give up love itself for God's sake. This is what Jesus has done in becoming a human being. This is what God the Father has done in begetting the Son of his bosom. To let go of everything you have, even the greatest thing, which is pure love, for love. And that brings us then to what centering prayer is not then a felt experience of God. Again, if you feel it, it's fine. But we don't hang on to it. We let it come and let it go. In other words, since God is always present, we need our heart, like our hands, always open. If your hand is always open, you can always receive. Once you possess something, even a great spiritual experience, you can't receive the next gift because your hand is closed. To always have it open means let it come, whatever God sends, with gratitude, let it go. And always turn our intention and our consent to God's presence and to his will as it unfolds in daily life. And finally, centering prayer is not discursive meditation or affective prayer. These are very valuable preparations of our psychological faculties for these deeper levels of communion and union. But centering prayer, as we've seen, goes beyond thinking and feeling and conceptualizing. And every action of ours, except the ever so gentle return to the sacred symbol, the sacred word, if you're using that, when you notice you're thinking about something else. Hence, here is a distinction to keep firmly in mind. Thinking you cannot avoid. There are always thoughts and perceptions. Thinking about the thoughts that are going by, you can learn to let go of. And so you become someone, like in the supermarket, you might say, who hears the background music, but who pays no attention to it. Because you're there for the groceries. And so any psychological experience during prayer is not God, but our interpretation of God at the level of spiritual unfoldment that we may have achieved. Now quickly, what is then centering prayer? We saw that it's a relationship above all else, a developing relationship with Christ and with God, to whom Jesus brings us as he promised. It's also a discipline to aid and foster that relationship. Hence, it's a method, not a technique, please, because it doesn't automatically do so. And God gives his gifts when, if, and as much as he feels is appropriate. It's a movement, centering prayer, from conversation to communion. It does not rule out any form of prayer. It simply puts them in a new perspective. And after periods of communion, as in that elderly couple I spoke about, or not so elderly for that matter, depends on the depth of their love, you still pour the coffee in the morning, you still do all the other conversing during the day. It just means one has the capacity to move the relationship to a further depth of even greater satisfaction than talking. It's a movement, therefore, from active prayer of discursive meditation and what is called effective prayer, which are acts of the will, not so much involved with emotions as the word sounds. It's a technical term for making acts of the will, like I love you, I ask for this or that, I praise you, I worship you, and many of the aspirations you find in the Psalms are examples of effective prayer. And you can be doing effective prayer, and as centering prayer develops, and at the same time be in this inner room, so that your attention is not so much on the words, but of the presence of God that is manifesting itself in the words. And so, hence, all our religious exercises and devotions are infused with a new light and a new perspective, so that we do them as if we were still in the private room. Although our letting go of all thoughts is a cultivation of interior silence and the discipline of the private room, but the effects, that's going to say, of the private room enables us to, in other religious exercises, to often move at the same time as we praise the Lord in song, to being with the Lord in the depths of our spirit and enjoying, so to speak, that presence. It habituates us, that is, centering prayer, to interior silence. It's a way of cultivating the spiritual level of our faculties. It's a way of learning God's first language, which is silence. And finally, it's an exercise of faith, hope, and charity. And these are the virtues, according to spiritual theology, that are transforming and of immense value, greater than the psychological experiences of God's presence that come and go. Faith, St. John of the Cross says, is the proximate means of union with God. And so it doesn't mean so much the details of a belief system. It means rather faith in the sense of trust, faith in the scriptural sense of surrendering ourselves completely to God. Now, obviously, that depth of that surrender can go on increasing. Hence, faith is purified in the night of sense and still deeper in the night of spirit, when all the human props that supported our belief system or faith, former level of faith, tend to disintegrate or be shattered. And that's why the nights are so disconcerting, because what we relied upon to go to God is taken away by pure faith, which goes to God without intermediary, directly, being to being, or as God said to Moses, face to face, a metaphor for presence to presence. And hope also is what brings us into the present moment. Theological hope is different from emotional hope, which is a hope for the future. Theological hope, or the hope that I'm referring to here that develops in contemplative prayer, is simply the trust in God's infinite power and mercy now. And so it does not refer to the past and is not influenced by whatever you did in the past, good, bad, or indifferent, but it depends on who you are in the present moment and how completely you're offering yourself to God with your whole of your being, in trusting yourself to God now. So hope brings us into the present moment and keeps us there. And charity is like patience, which enables you to stay put in the inner room when it's boring, tiresome, painful, a bombardment of thoughts, a heavy therapy session in which the dark side of our personality arrives, or the undeveloped material, or the undigested emotional material from early childhood comes to consciousness through primitive feelings or emotions. What it is then is a journey into the unknown, an adventure of faith, and an invitation to participate in the greatest project there is, which is the redemption of the world. As we pray in centering prayer, the whole world prays with us. And that's why during the prayer there's no need to pray particular intentions, because they're all included in the one desire to pray for the gift of the Spirit.